Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Meet the Press Reports, where each week we do an in-depth exploration of a single topic. Today, we have a unique and special episode. This is a war game that takes a look at how the United States might react if China were to invade Taiwan. The self-governed island, a little bigger than the state of Maryland, that sits about 100 miles off the coast of mainland China at the junction of the East and South China Seas. China has seen Taiwan as a breakaway province ever since Chiang Kai-shek and his forces fled there following their defeat by the communists in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. China has vowed to take control of this island, preferably, it says, by peaceful means, but possibly by force if necessary. Increasingly, U.S. officials warn it could be by force, and possibly sooner than we think. So what would the U.S. do? Well, the United States has ever closer ties with Taiwan, which it sees as a key partner in the Pacific Security Order. Whether the United States would defend Taiwan if it were attacked by China, however, is a matter of what's called strategic ambiguity, which has been the official policy for more than 40 years. The Pentagon, though, is unambiguously preparing for that possibility. And war games, which are simulations of military conflict that help develop and test strategies, well, these war games figure very prominently into those preparations. And we wanted to know more about these war games. What do they look like? How do they unfold? What would it take to win, especially in this moment we're in and what's happening in Ukraine? So to find out, we worked with the Gaming Lab at the Center for a New American Security, CNAS. This is a think tank that specializes in national security. CNAS convened two teams to fight it out here in our Washington studio. The Blue Team, a group of defense experts, members of Congress, and a retired Air Force general who played the role of American defense officials on the National Security Council advising the United States president. And the Red Team, China experts, and the CEO of CNAS played the part of China's Central Military Commission advising President Xi Jinping. CNAS drafted the terms of the hypothetical conflict, set 5 years from now, in 2027, with China poised to launch a direct attack on Taiwan to force unification after Taiwan had elected new leadership, increasingly defying Chinese pressure. How would the U.S. respond? There were 3 rounds and a game master from CNAS determining the new reality on the ground after each round. The Red Team had the benefit of proximity. The Blue Team had the benefit of allies and partners. Neither team had the edge, and that's where we begin.
As you can see here on the map is a very large concentration of Chinese People's Liberation Army forces at potential ports of debarkation for an invasion.
We want to focus on a last-ditch effort to deter. This is a time to be sending the strongest possible message to Beijing, both privately and publicly, that there will be very severe costs if they actually go through with this.
China has sort of seen our reaction to Ukraine, and we want to make sure that we're surprising them with how we react here.
Hit the Americans as hard as we possibly can in the Western Pacific, keep them out of the fight while we move on Taiwan.
I would support an early knockout punch against Guam.
From our point of view, a failed invasion of Taiwan is worse than the risk of conflict with the United States. We think that the United States is already going to intervene, and so we have to do a knockout punch before they can neutralize us.
Is the assumption that your assault on Guam is going to make the United States pull back?
We think it's going to make them militarily less effective. And so even if they desire to intervene, they won't have as much capacity to intervene on behalf of Taiwan.
I think we start very forcefully with a missile bombardment on Taiwan. I think we want to bring their military to their knees.
Are you making an assumption that China is going to attack any of the alliance as they attack Taiwan or not?
I think China doesn't want to. They would like to tell the world that we're going to discipline our unruly province and it's none of your business, stay out of it. And if we stay out of it, they'll stay out of it. But if we decide to defend Taiwan, then I think they will attack our forces around the region.
The priority for the first 24 hours is to try to go as fast as possible against Taipei, right? I think it matters to deter United States, Japan, Australia, and other countries from intervening.
We learned the lessons from Ukraine when the Russians let Zelensky survive, and he organized resistance. He got international support, and we're not going to let Taiwan do the same thing.
I think we try to keep Japan neutral. I think you
hit them in the port before they get out, because otherwise we know exactly where they're going, which is toward Taiwan to start shooting at us.
By hitting them in the port, you are guaranteeing that Japan is going to enter the conflict. Not sure that we can.
Would you rather take the American military station in Japan out to the greatest degree possible and have Japan enter the conflict, or let it steam toward Taipei, attack us, and have Japan maybe stay out of the conflict? Those are the two options.
You're going to attack Japan.
We are going to attack U.S. facilities on Japan, so U.S. air bases and U.S. ports that the U.S. uses in Japan. We are not yet going after Japanese air bases.
Part of this is communicating you're not just taking on this little rogue island that you see as your own, Taiwan. You're taking on the United States, Japan, Australia.
I'm sort of in the camp of let's be as aggressive as possible, short of launching a preemptive strike, if that makes sense.
Regardless of which course of action the Chinese Red Team takes here, if we are prepared for the bigger fight, the potential large strike campaign, we are better off than if we assume that there's going to be a blockade or a lower level fight and then suddenly find ourselves in a much bigger war.
The insight that comes from this is you have to have a peacetime posture that allows you to be prepared to deter on day zero and fight if deterrence doesn't work.
All right, Stacey, high level here. What just happened with Move 1?
China's invaded Taiwan. It began by attacking Taiwan's outlying islands near the mainland. Then it followed it with a large air and missile strike on Taiwan and on U.S. bases in Japan and on U.S. bases in Guam and the Northern Marianas. In response to that, the United States followed up with bomber attacks on on Chinese ships in port, and there was an air battle over Taiwan where American aircraft flying from the Philippines came in and engaged in combat with Chinese aircraft that were trying to bomb Taiwan.
So after Move 1, can you assess which team is winning?
I think it's a stalemate right now. China has strategically blundered by pulling Japan in, and the United States is still well positioned to defend, but China also has a lot of its assets left and has a lot of power that it can apply.
China went with a very, very aggressive strike campaign against U.S. forces and bases throughout the region.
The gloves are off, if you will. I mean, by attacking U.S. territory of Guam, killing Americans, the Chinese have crossed the line. I think they've also miscalculated already that they took some actions against U.S. forces in Japan that they thought would maybe prevent Japan from coming in. It actually drew Japan in. Same with Australia. How do we prevent the Chinese force that's trying to get across the Strait of Taiwan to actually be able to successfully land and start taking Taiwanese territory?
Now this is just a matter of getting as many things into the fight as we can, as quickly as possible. Getting the Australians involved in a blockade and checking out what's in the strait with the Marine Littoral Regiment subs, relying on our allies to watch the rear and maintain supply lines and maybe implement a blockade while we're fighting in the strait, in and around the straits with Taiwan.
We believe the longer this takes, the less able we will be able to achieve our objectives. And so we are in the course of this building in fallback positions, although we don't want to tell that to the other team. Move 2 is building on all of that and moving forward to land on Taiwan, to further try to take out American assets in the region, and also to go after Japan, which has entered the war.
The fact that they aggressively hit Guam and Japan was frankly just a very quick way to make sure our allies were all in. And now we have Japanese resources willing to contribute to air and undersea. We have Australians willing to contribute and others coming on board.
My sense is that you need to at least take out the airfields in northern Australia. So at least try to.
So like Darwin and Tyndall?
Darwin and Tyndall. The fuel tanks are very important because that's how those planes get refueled. And the runways are important because they need somewhere to take off.
In Hawaii, you have both obviously American territory, which they seek to preserve, plus you have all of the naval and air assets that the Americans have dispersed back that way once this war started, so there's a lot of targets out there. They hit our ports in China, we're going to take the fight to Hawaii.
I'm a little bit hesitant to use conventional kinetic attacks in Hawaii just because I feel that will be interpreted as a Pearl Harbor in the United States. We could galvanize significant U.S. support.
China's big strike, which was in response to the U.S. Attacking its ports, was on Hawaii. And they launched their stealth bombers, which launched cruise missiles and hypersonic weapons against Hawaii. It took out the command center on Hickam Air Force Base, where they're controlling Blue Air Forces and commanding the air war. So an American state has now been attacked.
What was the blue team's move?
The blue team was focused on destroying China's big warships that provide a lot of air defense for the invasion fleet. So they had submarines within the strait. I would say right now the red team is ahead. They're starting to make progress towards their objective of actually gaining control over Taiwanese territory. But they have a long, hard slog in front of them.
After move 1, you said we were at a stalemate. After move 2, what would you say?
I would say that China has a slight advantage right now because it's actually ashore. So it has made progress towards achieving its objective. It still has a long way to go. But both sides are probably running low of some of the key missiles and munitions that they use. So the character of the fight might change going forward.
All right. On to move 3.
I don't see anything in the game right now that means that the U.S. or the West would back down. I wonder if we could do a hemp shot not over, but near where the U.S. most of the U.S. forces are, because that would be clear signaling to them that we are serious about using nuclear weapons. But obviously, we wouldn't want it right over in this area at this point.
So you're saying a demonstration explosion?
Yeah, at higher altitude.
And is this a bluff, or are we really willing to use nuclear weapons?
I think that depends on folks in the room, but I think in a no-kidding Taiwan scenario, if we are really facing the prospect of defeat, we should be willing to use nuclear weapons. It might not be nuclear weapons on Taiwan. It could be a tactical nuke against invading U.S. or intervening U.S. forces.
A real big weakness is our inability to contest or threaten China's air superiority. We keep trying, but the difficulty is in our dispersed posture with limited access to tankers. We're not able to push enough tactical aviation forward over Taiwan to really maintain persistent air superiority or even just contest Chinese air superiority.
I think the key insight already in this game is if you have not spent years preparing for this, pre-positioning munitions, getting the Taiwanese ready, pre-positioning your own forces, developing your dispersal bases. If you haven't spent years preparing for this, then you're going to be behind the 8 ball the whole way. How about putting a bunch of SEALs on the island via submarines and try to support the Marines?
The biggest concern is that the United States will come roaring back with everything it has, not over a short period of time, but a long period of time. We have calculated that America's in and America's in. But there may be gradations of what it means for America to fight our country. And we have seen time and time again, once the enraged bull elephant is fully stirred, its ability to make war and to generate the resources to make war is unbelievably large. The only thing the Americans seem to declare defeat on is really, really long wars, not short, violent ones. Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever they wanted to go home, Vietnam, they wanted to go home. They get tired, but they don't get scared.
I think experience has shown that this bridgehead here, just like in Ukraine, it's not going to be over in a few days unless Taiwan capitulates. If you watched what happened in Ukraine, you know the actions that were taken before the invasion were important, but so is continued resupply. With Ukraine, you have borders that you can move things across. Taiwan's a long ways off.
So here we are after move 3. The blue team, the United States, seemed to try to do what it could to make command and control more difficult in the actual invasion itself of Taiwan and all of that. China and the red team wanted to send more of a message to the United States, attempting to strike Alaska and California, San Diego specifically, plus Hawaii again. So escalation everywhere, including a nuclear test by China to essentially make the United States take the nuclear option more seriously. So where are we now?
Things spiraled really quickly. The headline is the nuclear test, which is unprecedented since World War II. We haven't seen limited nuclear use, certainly during combat. We don't know where things go from here. There were also the attempted strikes on the United States. China has continued to reinforce its lodgment on Taiwan, but it's still very small and it's heavily contested. The U.S. is pushing in some of its ships now that munition stockpiles have gone down to try to support them, and it looks like we're in for a long, hard fight.
So best case scenario is that it's a ground war in Taiwan. Worst case scenario is we're starting to have some nuclear exchanges.
Yes. China still has its intercontinental ballistic missiles that are nuclear armed, but it also has the ones that can range Guam and sort of this area that it could use, which have nuclear warheads.
Well, there are a lot of lessons to take away from this. This was fascinating, and I can't wait to get to the lessons learned portion when we do that in a little bit.
Great.
Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you.
So the stakes, pretty high. And at the end of 3 moves, so are the costs on both sides of this fight, which is why avoiding war altogether may be in both countries' best interest. We're going to talk over that and other key takeaways from this game when we come back. Welcome back. After the exercise wrapped, I sat down with Dr. Stacey Pettyjohn, our game master and the director of the defense program at CNAS, to talk about the results. And we were joined by 2 players from each team. From the blue team were the 2 members of Congress, Mike Gallagher, Republican, Wisconsin, and Mikey Sherrill, Democrat, New Jersey. And from the red team, it was Bonnie Lin, the director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Joel Withnow, a senior research fellow at the National Defense University.
Stacey, I want to start with you. What did you learn?
I think I was surprised by how quickly things escalated and the fact that the blue team didn't really seem to believe the red team's threats about nuclear use. That didn't seem to be honored. It seemed to me that they thought that they were bluffing, and they were willing to call that bluff.
With I would say the plan going in, I remember you explaining to me, we're going to go in quickly. We're going to go in with big force, and we're going to end this quickly. That didn't happen.
Well, the Americans put up a fight. We sacrificed a lot. I was unsatisfied that we weren't able to take out Taiwan's president early in the game, and so we had to move harder throughout the game. We paid a big price, but ultimately, I don't think we lost. I think we got the foothold that we wanted, and we'll get the prize, but we will have paid an enormous cost in blood and treasure to have gotten it.
Bonnie, the decision to target Japan, is that going to be, assuming this war gets drawn out in this scenario, is that going to be an initial mistake or miscalculation from the red team or the Chinese side?
I don't see that as a miscalculation. One of the things that we discussed during the team is of the U.S. allies and partners, which U.S. ally or partner we knew would be involved in the conflict. And we were most certain that regardless of what the scenario was, if it was a crisis or a major conflict in Taiwan, Japan would be there to support the United States. So for us, the calculation was, do we want to take out the assets in Japan now while they're still relatively easier to target, or do we want to wait later when it was much more difficult to strike Japan, and knowing either way that Japan would be in the fight with the United States.
So they went with a preemptive strike, essentially, on Japan. You guys debated, and it's my understanding there was a little bit of debate on that first move. Should the U.S. side be more aggressive? Explain.
Well, obviously, I think particularly if China's pursuing a fait accompli strategy, the quicker that goes, the more they're actually able to establish facts on the ground in Taiwan, the more difficult it is for us to react to that, right? The same thing that makes Taiwan a difficult problem geographically for the Chinese to solve makes it very difficult for us to resupply. So if we weren't going to do a preemptive strike because we wanted the moral authority that came from responding to an attack on us, we at least wanted to be ready to start taking out their ships while they were in port, while they were transiting across the strait. And I think, the lesson for me is just how costly deterrence failures are. We've become accustomed to sort of low-intensity conflict over the last 2 decades. If this happens, a lot of people are going to lose their life, which is why we want deterrence to actually work, and which is why we need hard power in place prior to the conflict breaking out.
Mickey Sherrill, when I hear some other country has air superiority over anything, we're the United States of America, but obviously we're a lot closer to their mainland there. That was, to me, a surprise that we could not establish air superiority over Taiwan.
Well, certainly, I think what we've been so concerned about on the House Armed Services Committee is the fact that we see China's growing predominance in certain areas and catching up very, very quickly to what had been for decades really presumed superiority in military matters by the United States. And what was so helpful to both of us was to be at the table for this war game, so that when we do make decisions for this country, when we are looking at how we modernize our military and where we strategically use the taxpayer resources that we're given most effectively, that we're thinking about how to really, as Mike said, how to make sure this never happens. How do we make sure that we are able to present such a credible threat across the world that we never actually have to go into a hot war like this?
Bonnie, you were saying one thing we just don't know is what the Chinese, what the Red Team derived the decision-making process was through the writings of the army, of the Chinese army, and you were very, stuck to that script. What do you suspect they are going to take away from Russia's essentially failed attempt to do what the Chinese strategy for your Chinese strategy to do here was, which is to take Taiwan quickly? That was the Russian strategy. It didn't work for them, and it didn't work for the Chinese.
So I think China looks at what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and they don't see the Russian failure as directly applicable to the PLA because of the differences in how Russia invaded Ukraine versus how China plans for Taiwan. So one thing I think China is going to take away is, as exactly like what we did with the war game, was China is going to try to move much faster on Taipei, decapitation, and concentrate its forces on Taipei. One other thing that China is taking away is the extent to which Russia's nuclear signaling deterred the United States and NATO from going into Ukraine. So I don't think the Chinese necessarily are confident that nuclear weapons will deter the United States from intervening to help Taiwan, but China is going to invest in its nuclear capabilities and will likely play up nuclear signaling in a Taiwan conflict. You know,
Joel, Michelle Flournoy told me after one of the debriefs, after one of the moves, that she was surprised that the Chinese fired the first shot at first, meaning her assumption was they would just slowly move their ships, basically go as close as they could without ever firing a shot. And then all of a sudden, what are we going to do? They're at the front door of Taiwan.
Well, I think in reality what would happen is that China may indeed use a large-scale exercise as the cover for an actual invasion, much as Russia has tried to do this. I also think that China will be better at Russia. I think they will do large-scale exercises year over year over year and make it very difficult for us in the U.S. side to determine what is an exercise and what would be the actual invasion. That being said, from our point of view, we have to establish air and maritime superiority, which means that we have to fire the first shot.
Stacey, what is the idea that I feel like we're very familiar with Russia's aspiration to use tactical nukes. Where are the Chinese right now actually on this front? And obviously in 5 years they aspire to be better at it. But do they think that you can use nukes tactically?
Other people at this table are probably better positioned to answer this than me, but no, their doctrine is explicitly no first use. But a lot of people are beginning to question that because their nuclear posture is changing and they're expanding their arsenal so much. They're building new nuclear weapons and new types of weapons where some of those medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles that they used in the game, they can also carry nuclear warheads.
So my biggest takeaway, and I want to save this last question for the two of you because you're the elected officials. You're going to have to try to do this. We need an Asian NATO. It is pretty clear we need one. Look at all of the assets we have to tap into right now to help Ukraine. And so quickly, whether it's Slovakia, whether it's in Poland, there's not as many assets. That's what I learned from this. Can we do it?
Well, certainly we have a lot of friends in the Indo-PACOM region. And we spoke about some of our allies today, and I think there were some other allies in the region that maybe would have been a bit more helpful than was presented in the scenario.
Korea would be
South Korea.
The biggest one. Yeah.
But I do think there's a discussion to be had about about doing more outreach here, doing more diplomacy here. There has been a hesitancy because of China's economic predominance. I'm wondering now, as we look at what's just happened with Ukraine, if some of our allies in the region aren't more willing to become to form a stronger partnership with each other and with the United States to ensure that they don't face some of these threats.
Mike Gallagher, I go back to the decision by both essentially leaders of the political parties in 2016 to walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was going to be essentially what could have been step one in creating a Western or a small d democratic umbrella in Asia. We didn't do it. Is it possible to, how do we do it now?
Well, we may have to start with certain bilateral agreements and put aside sort of the economic agreements. I think we have an urgent need for more basing agreements in the region. And that became very apparent throughout the war game. We had 3 treaty allies that were involved in the conflict, but we still struggled to project power where we needed to project it. We quickly in the game clarified the policy of strategic ambiguity. We suggested that the president make it explicit that we would defend Taiwan. That's something we need to re-examine in Congress, I think, very quickly, because we can't wait 2 weeks, 3 weeks if Congress isn't in session to have the debate and potentially give the president the authority he needs to defend Taiwan. So there are ways we can make progress, even though a big regional trade agreement is probably not likely in the short term.
Well, I have to say, this was fascinating. I learned a lot, and I hope some of the knowledge I learned we never have to actually use on air. No offense, guys. But thanks for making us a bit smarter.
That's all we have for this episode of Meet the Press Reports. Thanks for being here. And this is the end of our spring season, so check out the full spring season of Meet the Press Reports. It's available on demand right now in Peacock, wherever you get NBC News Now. Episodes on public schools, how they became center stage for our country's culture wars, the explosive growth of cryptocurrency, just what is it? The rise of misinformation in another language in this country, the history of racial inequality in football, the race to carbon neutrality, how the Democratic Party lost rural America, and how important the black church is to whatever success the Democratic Party can have. That's just one half season. I'll see you next fall on Meet the Press Reports and this Sunday on Meet the Press.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.